Now, it really is such a common mistake, and I've done it myself, but this is definitely one that you need to watch out for when you're knitting shawls. Hey nerdy knitters, Tanya here. Let's settle in and chat about shawl knitting. Shawls are popular for good reason. They're fun to knit with all those colors and textures and stitch patterns. You don't have to be so concerned about gauge. It's not like if you're knitting a sweater or a pullover or cardigan, you want to be pretty careful with your gauge to make sure that garment fits. But you don't have to be so cautious about that when you're knitting shawls. So there's lots of reasons people love to knit them, and those are just a few. And we're going to talk about lots of different shawl topics today. We'll talk about some of the most popular shapes that they can be knit in, blocking tips for your shawls, mistakes that I often see shawl knitters make, and some book recommendations, specifically for those people who want to really make customized shawls. These aren't books that are just full of knitting patterns for shawls. There are some, but the real focus of the books is to help you make your own shawl patterns following different formulas or recipes, but really custom ways to make shawls. So let's start with shawl shapes. We're just going to do a quick overview. I've done videos on lots of different shawl shapes. We've talked about the different ways triangle shawls can be constructed. There are lots of ways. We've talked about the different ways half circle shawls and crescent shawls can be constructed, and we've talked about rectangle shawls. We haven't touched on shawls that are knit from the center out, like circle shawls or square shawls, or lots of other different shapes actually as well. There are plenty of them, but we're just going to go through them very quickly. So first off, we've got triangle shawls, and these are probably the most popular. And a good place to start is a top-down triangle shawl, like this tiny little thing right here. You start right here at the center and you work increases at 4 points, and then it gives you 2 triangles that become one larger triangle. It's a very popular method for knitting shawls. But you can also start at the bottom, like this one right here. It starts at the bottom point and increases at both edges, binding off on the top for a bottom-up shawl. But you can also cast on all of the stitches along the bottom edge and decrease down to the top point. So that's 3 different ways. There's more actually, but those are 3 ways that you can get that basic triangle shape. And then we've got those asymmetrical triangle shawls. Now this one starts at 1 tip and you increase at both edges and then bind off over here, and that gives you one sort of triangle shape. Then another very popular method is an asymmetrical triangle. Now this one, you're actually increasing along one edge but decreasing at the other. And this gives you that long neck edge. And the more increases you work along that edge, the longer and curlier that neck edge is. And then you're binding off over on this other side. Then you can also knit a triangle shawl tip to tip by increasing along one point and then decreasing along that same point. Then there's also the kite shawl method, where you are decreasing along the center and then increasing at both edges, and then you a bit more going on in this one, but it also forms sort of a triangle shape. So that's all the triangle shawl shapes. There's more ways to do them. You've got short rows, other different methods, but those are probably the basic ones. And then you can change these slightly and end up with half circles instead of triangles. So if we take our top-down triangle shawl, but instead of working those stitches right down the center, those increases, we move them off to the sides, we lose that point down in the bottom, and instead we get a half circle shape. Then we can also work those increases in like a swirl pattern. And then if you just work those increases at the edges, you get crescent shawl shapes, and you can change your rate of increase to change the wingspan of that shawl as well. Then we've got the half pie shawl, which is an invention by Elizabeth Zimmerman, where she used math to figure out, using diameter and circumference and the math of pi to figure out this shawl shape, where you're working a number of rows and then you double your stitch count, and then you work double the number of rows and you double your stitch count again. And that gives us, well, a full circle shawl, but then also a half circle as well. Then of course there are rectangle shawls, and the simplest of those would be basically a scarf. You can knit a rectangle from one short end to the other. You could work from both ends to the center, graft them together. You could work from the center out on both ends using a provisional cast on. Depending on the stitch patterns you're using, you could choose any of those methods. But you can also knit a rectangle shawl by casting on all the stitches along one of the long edges and then knitting to the other long edge. But then if a rectangle is a little too boring, you can add some bias shaping. You can start at a point, increase at both edges, and then work an increase at one edge and a decrease at the other till it's as long as you want, and then decrease at both edges. And that gives you one type of rectangle. Or you can cast on all of your stitches and work an increase at one edge and a decrease at the other, and that creates that bias shaping as well. And then for even something a little more interesting, you can do sort of a chevron shape where you increase in the middle, you're decreasing at both edges, and that gives you that bias going off in two different directions. I feel like I need to take a little breath because we just barreled right through all of that information about the different ways to knit a shawl, the different shawl shapes. And there's even more than that. You can knit them from the center out in lots of different shapes. You can add short rows. If you take a rectangle shawl that's knit from one long edge to the other, you add some short rows to it, then you can make that into a crescent shawl. There's other ways to add short rows to make even more interesting shapes, but these are probably the basic shapes that you can adjust and change. And if you just took all of these, I don't even know how many that was that we just flew through, but if you took all of those and you add different yarns, different ways to add color, different stitch patterns, there's just so many countless ways to make a shawl. So you just start with one of these shapes that you like. Start with something simple like garter stitch or stockinette and add stitch patterns, add color, and then you can really customize and create your own shawl. Or of course, just buy a pattern where somebody's done all that work for you. And it's just, there's so much fun to knit, and there's so many different ways to wear them. If you like to wear those oversized triangles, sort of like, I think they look like a bib on me at least, they don't look so great. I prefer ones that have a longer wingspan, so I can wrap them around my neck like a scarf or sort of cuddle up in them like a blanket if they're big enough. But they're just, shawls are really fun to knit, and they're very popular for a reason. So once you've knit your shawl, the next step is taking care of it, which in knitting terms is sometimes referred to as blocking, but that really goes with the first part of that would be washing, how you're going to take care of that shawl. And for the most part, I'm going to settle into my knitting now too while we talk about this part. I give all of my shawls, unless the yarn says otherwise, I give them one good wash to start with. And after that, I don't wash them very much. They don't get very dirty. If they do get dirty, then I would wash them again, especially if I'm putting them away for the summer, because I wouldn't want them to get eaten by moths or anything. And it's not the fibers that moths are attracted to, it's the hair and the skin cells and the grease and different things that end up on your garments. So, and of course there are probably other critters as well that do like fibers, but moths specifically, it's not so much the fiber they're attracted to as the other things that end up on that garment. And really, unless I'm wearing it close to my face a lot, it's not getting very dirty. But I do like to give it one good wash to start, just to clean it, freshen it up, and of course to even out all the stitch patterns and to straighten edges if I need to. So we have talked about blocking before. We really dove deep into that, and I will link to that video below. But I want to talk about specifically how it applies to shawl knitting. And of course there is wet blocking. That would be the first thing I would do, unless the yarn specifically says not to get it wet. Then in almost all instances, I'm going to give it a soak for about 20 minutes. Unless it's very fragile yarn like silk, where I would be very careful just getting it a little bit wet and very gently squeezing it and laying it out. Or cotton. Cotton is pretty heavy and it does absorb a lot of water, but it sort of gets weak when it's wet as well. So I might not soak that very much either, but most other fibers I think are just going to be, they'll be just fine. So I would do that warm soak. I would get a little basin, add a little bit of wool wash, do some lukewarm to warm water, and then put my shawl in it and then sort of squish it down. I don't want to agitate it a lot, but I just want to make sure that water gets absorbed into that fiber, because that's what helps even out your stitches, and it also cleans the yarn as well. But you want that water to absorb, and wool wash actually helps that water to absorb even more. So it's nice to add that. If you don't want to use wool wash, you can use hair conditioner, a gentle shampoo, anything like that would really work. So I would make sure it's fully submerged and then leave it to soak for 20 or 30 minutes and then come back, squeeze out all of that water very gently. I'm not squishing and twisting and wringing it out. I'm just gently squeezing it and then laying it on some mats or a towel, even a garbage bag or a mesh sweater dryer, any of those things to let it dry. Now, depending on the fiber content and the stitch patterns you've used, you might want to pin it out with some pins or some blocking wires. If you've knit a lace shawl, you're going to want to stretch that out so you can open up that lace. If you've knit a shawl that has like a brioche shawl or garter stitch even, depending, brioche, I don't want to stretch out. I want to keep that squishy factor. So I will just sort of lay it flat and make sure my edges are even. And that's about it. Like, you don't have to stretch every shawl out of shape. Really think about what the stitch patterns are and how they should be treated, as well as the yarn. So it really depends on what you're going for. If you want to do an aggressive block, which is usually what's referred to when you're talking about lace, when you're talking about pins and wires, you're talking about stretching that out a lot, but that is intended to open up that stitch pattern. So in that case, you really do want to do that, but you don't necessarily want to do that every time. A lot of the time, like in the example I'm showing here, I just have some basic stitch patterns. There's nothing that's curling, though I don't need to really pin it out. I just want to make sure it's in the shape it's supposed to be when it's finished. So I'm just going to lay it flat, push it out to the shape I want it, and just let it dry. And for almost every shawl I knit, this is always my finishing step. I've woven in my ends, and then I give it a good soak, and then I place it out to let it dry in some manner. Sometimes that does involve pins if there's lace involved. But then after I've done that once, for shawl specifically, I don't usually have to do it again unless it gets dirty. But I might want to refresh it, and that's when I use one of the other two methods, either steam or spray. And depending on the stitch patterns or the yarn, I will choose one or the other. If it's a very delicate fiber, then most likely I'm going to just spray it with some water. So I will place it out on my mats, my blocking board, on a towel, anything like that. And if I need to, I will pin it out. If I've got some sort of lace edging and I just want to refresh that, I might just pin out that edge to make sure that lace is opening up and getting refreshed. And then I will use a spray bottle with a bit of wool wash in it. If you use a no rinse kind, then it's totally fine to put it in your spray bottle as well, and give it a nice good spray. And if I am using pins and I'm concerned about all of the excess water, I will dab off the water off the pins. You should look for rust proof pins so you don't end up with any rust stains, but just in case, you know, if you got water on there, try to dab it off your pins at least. And that's a good way to refresh a shawl without having to give it another big full soak. If you just want to freshen it up, like even out some stitch patterns or anything like that. If I had to clean it, then I would go back to the wet soaking stage and redo that. But if it doesn't need to be cleaned, then just a good spray can help. Or the alternative would be steam. Steam is great for a lot of fibers. They're good for plant fibers. Cotton does fine with steam. So anytime you would use that, like spraying, if you want to just freshen something up, open up some stitch patterns again, or just give it a nice little touch up. Or if it's starting to, I don't know, smell a little funky maybe, then some steam can help with that as well. So, but of course, I would always do the wet blocking if it actually needs to be cleaned. And steam is just another great way to refresh something, depending on the fibers you're using. I don't think I would use it on silk. I like spray blocking to keep something 100% silk. You really want to treat very, very gently. Silk in a blend is probably okay to wet block and to spray block. Steam, I would, if you're not sure about which method for your yarn, you could knit like 3 tiny little swatches, like 2 inches square, and then test each method to see which ones you like best and to make sure it's not going to ruin your shawl. You don't want to test steaming a shawl if you're not sure how that yarn is going to react. Don't try it on the shawl, try it on like a little tiny test swatch. And even better if you can do like a few stitches in your stitch pattern to see how that stitch pattern reacts, as well as the yarn, to that blocking method. A few weeks ago, we spent a lot of time talking about the different blocking methods and when to use each one, and beyond just talking about shawls. So I'll put a link to that video down below. And there was also like a free printable page that talked about all the different methods and when to use them. And you'll find out more about that in the other video if you want to go check that out. So let's move on to mistakes. And there are some pretty common mistakes that shawl knitters can make. I've made my fair number of these mistakes as well, so I know what I'm talking about here. Now, the first one would be swatching. I know, we swatch for sweaters so we can make sure they fit. Otherwise, your sweater is going to be your swatch if you haven't actually swatched for it. And the same can be said for shawls as well. And I know that's why a lot of people like shawls, is because they feel like they can skip the swatching stage and just get right to the knitting, which I never really understood, because isn't swatching just knitting too? Just a smaller piece. But those who are like the project or product focused, they want that end thing. They don't like the swatching stage so much. But sometimes you want to swatch even if it's just a shawl, and gauge might not be so important for a few reasons. One, if you're not sure about how much yarn you're going to take, because if you're not checking your gauge, you could use a lot more yarn than the designer intended in her pattern with her gauge. And if you only bought the very same amount of yarn and you're not getting the size of the shawl that you wanted, it could be because your gauge is different. So if you're concerned about the amount of yarn you have and you want to make sure that you're getting the size shawl that you want, then a gauge swatch is important in that case. And a lot of people always say they feel like it's wasting yarn, but in most instances you can rip out that yarn from the swatch and reuse it. You're not going to have to throw it away or never use it for anything again. I've ripped out yarn so many times, whole projects even, to reuse the yarn. And swatches are the same. You can rip them out and use that yarn again. So you're not wasting yarn. And another reason you might want to swatch is to choose the right needle size and to create the fabric that you want. Unless you're really intending it to be a really close, tight shawl, maybe for winter. In most cases, you want a nice drapey shawl that flows really well. And if you knit tight or you choose smaller needles than you probably should have, the fabric might not be the way you want it to be or the way you envisioned. And that's another instance where swatching would help you decide which needle size to use, so you get the fabric that you want. So it can be important for gauge, especially if you're concerned about how much yarn you're going to use and the size that you want to knit, and making sure you have enough yarn for that size, and also for the fabric itself. You really don't want to knit half a shawl and look at it and realize that you really just don't like the fabric, that you would like it looser or even tighter if it's too loose. It's better to start with even just a little swatch to figure out if the fabric is right. You don't have to knit a 6-inch swatch for that. If you're not concerned about the gauge and you just want to test the fabric, just maybe 3 inches. That should be plenty for figuring out how the fabric of the shawl is going to be. Now, another very common thing is to bind off too tightly, and I've done this plenty of times. You really want to be careful with shawls, because especially if it's lace or if it's something you know you're going to want to stretch at all to affect the shape. If you bind off too tightly, you're not going to be able to stretch that bind off edge. It's only going to stretch as much as that bind off will allow. So there's a few different things you can do. You can use a special bind off that's made to be very stretchy, like Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off, where you're working yarn overs in there to create a really stretchy edge. If it doesn't need to be that stretchy, I like to do a little trick where, if you're thinking of the basic bind off, instead of pulling the needle out after forming the stitch, I like to leave my needle in there. I've got a video about this that explains it a little bit better, so I'll link to that as well. But I leave the stitch on my needle while I'm binding it off, the stitch I've just created, and that just gives it a little more slack. That's a good way to get just a little more stretch in your bind off, but it's not super, super stretchy. But there's plenty of methods, or even if you want something decorative, a Picot Bind Off adds a lot of extra stretch to a shawl edge, and you can add that to any shawl that you want if you want a picot edge on it. It's very easy to add one of those. I've got a video about that as well. But you just want to be careful that your bind off is going to be stretchy enough to accommodate however wide you want to stretch it out in that blocking phase. And along with that is also the edge stitches. Not just that bind off edge, but the edges, the other edges of the shawl as well. Whether you're doing whatever shape you're doing, you want to make sure that your edges aren't too tight, because you can run into the same instance where you are blocking it out. Say it's like a top-down triangle. I've done this one for myself, It was a garter stitch edge. I'm like, oh, garter stitch, that's plenty stretchy. I don't have to be worried. It was on the side of too tight. I wish it had been looser because I could have stretched that top edge more. So that's another place where you want to be careful with your tension. It's also another way, a time you could swatch to check those edge stitches to make sure they're stretchy enough. But there are a few things you can do. If you think about like a common edge stitch for a shawl is garter stitch. And in many cases, garter stitch is stretchy enough, but when you want it a little bit stretchier, there's one thing you can actually do. You can form garter stitch in two ways. You can knit every row, and that forms garter stitch, but you can also purl every row, and that makes garter stitch as well. So on the whole, knitters, I'm going to say this is very generalized, and it might change depending on how you knit, but knitters who hold their yarn in their right hand as they're knitting, in general, their purl stitches are looser than their knit stitches. So those garter edges, instead of knitting every row for that garter edge on your shawl, you could purl every row just along that edge. Say it's 3 stitches. Instead, if it says knit 3, then you purl 3 instead. Do that on every single row, and that will give you a more loose edge. This might not work for those of us who hold the yarn in our left hand when we knit, because at least for me, I have a tendency to purl more tightly than I knit. So this trick doesn't work for me. I just need to be mindful that I'm knitting those garter edge stitches very loosely. What if it's other stitch patterns though? Like an I-cord edge. There's a really neat trick for this as well, because I-cord can also be one of those instances where it's not stretchy enough for your shawl. And I saw a trick from Stephen West, and I'm going to link to his video down below for this, so it explains it better than I do here. Where if you think about your I-cord, whether it's attached to a shawl or not, it's going to be worked the same. You're going to knit those stitches, let's say it's 3, and then instead of turning your work and knitting them again, you're going to slip them without knitting them. And usually, let's say the common example is to knit those 3 stitches at the beginning of the row, and then you move across your shawl. Then at the end of the row, you bring the yarn to the front and slip those 3 stitches. So when you turn your work, you are knitting across that first section and then slipping those last 3. So say you are working at the beginning of a right side row, you knit across those 3 I-cord stitches, but instead of just continuing on with your shawl, you slip them back to your left needle and you just knit them again. So you're adding just a bit of length to just the I-cord, not the shawl itself. And it's harder to explain here, so I'll link to his video, but that's another great way to add a bit more length to the I-cord edge so you can make sure that edge is stretchy enough. And this is also one of those cases where when you're swatching, you could swatch your edge stitches as well to make sure they're going to be stretchy enough. So another case for swatching even for shawls. Now, another mistake that is fairly common is not making use of stitch markers and lifelines, especially if you've got a shawl that has like a charted pattern or lots of instructions and lots of potential to make mistakes. This is when I like liberal use of a lifeline, which is just running a thread. Usually I like to use sock yarn or even embroidery thread when I'm knitting something with sock yarn or fingering weight yarn. You're just running it through one row of stitches where you know everything before that point is correct. There are no mistakes. Then as you're working, if you make a mistake, you don't have to rip out the whole thing. You can just rip back to that point, or even practice dropping down to fix your mistake. And if that doesn't work, you can rip back to that lifeline and you haven't lost absolutely everything. And in that same vein, I would say stitch markers, especially if I'm knitting something with lace or anything where there's like a repeat of the pattern, I separate them. So each repeat is between its own stitch markers, so I can keep track of the number of stitches that should be in each section. And if I'm working across like the wrong side rows, sometimes if you're knitting a lace pattern, the wrong side rows maybe just purling or just knitting, but I can count and make sure I didn't forget a yarn over, because at that point, if I did forget one, it's easy enough to pick one up, just like making a make one. You can just pick it up and keep on going. But if I've come back 2 rows later and realized, oh wait, I missed a yarn over, it's a little more, not impossible, but it is a little more complicated. So I like to use lifelines and stitch markers to make sure that I'm keeping track of everything I'm doing, and I'm not going to have to rip out too much of my work if or when I make a mistake. I would love to know what mistakes you've noticed when you've been knitting shawls. If there's anything that I forgot to add here that you think should be added, or you'd want to make other knitters aware, say it's sort of like a public service announcement, be careful of these mistakes, then leave a comment and share those mistakes that you've done or you've seen and you want to keep other knitters from making by giving them fair warning to watch out for these things. Now I want to talk about a few books that I would recommend for shawl knitting, and I'm not talking about those books where it's just full of shawl patterns. Those are great too. I've got some that I really like. Melanie Berg has a great shawl book. There's a couple Stephen West shawl books that are just full of great, innovative, beautiful shawl knitting patterns. But I'm talking about those books that help you customize and create your own shawl creations for yourself, or perhaps even if you want to design. They're a great place to start because they give you sort of an idea of how things work. And there's 3 that I would recommend. First would be the Knit Picks Shawls for All book. And I've got it somewhere. I don't know where it is. I can't find it. I think I'm just going to end up buying another copy because right now it's on sale. I think it's still on sale for $5. Really can't beat that for what's in this book. So this one includes lots of great information specifically for lace shawl knitting. It comes in 2 different yarn weights, so you can pick your yarn weight, but of course you could change it even. You just want to figure out your own gauge for that pattern. And then it has a whole section of the different shawl shapes themselves. Like we just talked about, all of these shawl shapes. This book includes 6 different ones, like the top-down triangle, crescent shawls, a full square shawl from the center out. I can't remember what else it has, but there's 6 different shapes. And then you've got these lace stitch patterns that go all over the body of the shawl. And there are 12 of those. So you pick your shape and then you pick the stitch pattern that you like. And then there's also edge stitch patterns. So if you want a really nice lacy edge that's a little bit different from the shawl body, then there's 6 of those. So you can see how you can mix and match all of these things. And there's even options for different bind offs to give you a nice, because with lace, you really want a nice stretchy bind off as well. So it's a really great way to customize things. Now, I don't think this one has written instructions for the different stitch patterns. I'm fairly sure they're just charted, but I think it's been a while since I've seen the book. I can't find my copy, but it really is great if you want to explore lace shawl knitting and you really want to customize and create your own mix and match sort of style. Then I would recommend 2 more books that I do have with me. Custom Shawls for the Curious and Creative Knitter. This one is by Kate Atherley and Kim McBrien Evans. So it's got a 10-page section where it talks about all of the different shapes, like we've discussed earlier. Lots of those shapes and other ones as well. Has the basic instructions to create that shape. It has a picture of how that is constructed and also like a little swatch demonstrating what it should look like, so you can practice these different shapes for yourself. Then it's got a lot of great information about like your yarn choice, your color choices, different techniques that you're going to probably want to know to knit different shawls. It has a great stitch dictionary in here as well, so you can take these basic shawl shapes and add stitch patterns to them and really create something unique and custom. And then there's a really great section where it's basically called Breaking the Rules, where they're taking these basic instructions, but they're adding short rows and they're changing the rate of increase or decrease to change the shape of the shawl. There's really so much you can do. You can really, once you understand the basic shapes, you can really change things up, change your increases, change your decreases, add some short rows, and that adds even more interesting elements to the shawl shapes. And there are some patterns as well, so you can see how they take these basics and change things up to create a variety of different shawls. And another really great book is Knitting Modular Shawls, Wraps, and Stoles by Melissa Leapman. This one is fabulous and it's got tons and tons of stitch patterns in here. So this one, the actual section for the modular, the shaping, is done in a very, very short section. The most of the book is actually stitch patterns. But what's really cool about this is because you're using a triangle to create all of these different shapes. All of the stitch patterns are charted in that triangle shape already, or they're written out with written instructions with that triangle shape in mind. And then she takes that and then shows you how to combine triangles to create different shawls. Like a regular top-down triangle shawl is actually 2 triangles just work together to create one larger triangle. But then she builds on that even more, and you get all of these interesting different shapes, like this one right here, where you're just adding more triangles, you're changing the different shapes. You can see some of the other designs here on the back of the book. So it does include some patterns as well, and she shows you how she does that. This one, she breaks it down into 7 steps, like choosing the body stitch pattern, choosing how you're going to work, how many triangles you're going to work and how you're going to join them together, choosing your edge stitches, and adding borders or insertions and all these different things that you can do. She breaks it into 7 steps, and then at the end she has a section that does have some patterns, and she shows you how she took those 7 steps and created all of these different really very pretty shawls. So I really like this one. I love that the stitch patterns are all charted into that triangular shape, and then you just take those triangles and you make 3 and you seam them together to make a rectangle, or just, she's got some really great ideas for how to do that in this book. So this is another great way to customize and create your own shawls. So I think that's enough shawl knitting chat for one day. And if you'd love to continue this conversation in the comments, then I would love your feedback, your tips, mistakes that you've made that we haven't talked about, or your favorite shawl designers, or if you've got another book recommendation. I would love to hear about it, so leave a comment. If you're looking for more tips and advice, go see what other knitters have to say, because they really do leave such fabulous feedback and tips, and I love to read what you have to say. And I often share it in future videos because your feedback is just, it's great, and I love to read it. So thank you for sharing. And if you just want to hang out and watch some more about shawl knitting, I'll put a playlist right here with some great videos about different shawl shapes or favorite shawl knitting patterns. So click through and I'll see you in the next video.